Welcome back. It was a crime which pushed everything else off the front pages. 3 men, all known criminals, found shot dead in the Essex countryside. It was a cold-blooded, professional killing. The victims had many enemies, but which one wanted them executed?
And welcome back to a new video on the Essex Boys case. As always, if you are enjoying the content, please do give the video a thumbs up. And if you're interested in the Essex Boys case, or simply true crime in general, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. And in this video, we're going to take a look at some interesting points which have been raised by Michael Steele concerning the condition of the Range Rover when it was discovered back on the 7th of December 1995. Now, for many people who are interested in the Essex Boys case, the lack of frost and snow on the Range Rover when it was discovered is a huge talking point. According to prosecution, the Range Rover had been there since 7 p.m. the night before. Yet Michael Steele puts forward a different explanation as to why the Range Rover was found in the condition it was. He believes it's possible that the Range Rover was coated with antifreeze. Let's now take a full and in-depth look at this section of the appeal document, and then I'll join you afterwards with my own thoughts and theories. Issue 2. Expert Report by Mr. Roonacres, Section 56. As explained at paragraph 48 above, the Commission has considered Mr. W's new statement in the context of a number of trial witnesses, including Mr. Peter Theobald, who discovered the Range Rover just before 8 a.m. on the 7th of December 1995. In view of the fact that there was no snow or frost on the vehicle, Mr. Theobald testified that he had formed and remained of the opinion that the Range Rover had not been in the lane overnight. This aspect of Mr. Theobald's trial evidence thus contradicted Darren Nichols' account that the Range Rover had been in the lane since around 7 p.m. on the 6th of December 1995. Having considered Mr. Theobald's evidence, the Commission decided to seek expert advice on the question of whether or not the absence of snow and frost from the surfaces of the vehicle could give any useful indication as to how long it had been situated in Workhouse Lane before being discovered. The Commission wished to discover whether expert evidence might offer support for the proposition that the victim's Range Rover arrived in the lane far later than claimed by Darren Nichols, and as suggested by the statement of Mr. W and the trial evidence of William Jasper, Stephen Rogers and Peter Theobald. On the 29th of September 2009, the Commission instructed forensic meteorologist Mr. Roonacres to provide his expert opinion. The Commission asked Mr. Roonacres to complete a comprehensive search of all available sources which could establish the prevailing weather conditions for Workhouse Lane on the 6th and 7th of December 1995. The Commission also asked Mr. Roonacres to provide his expert opinion on how long he believed the Range Rover had been in Workhouse Lane by the time it was discovered just before 8 a.m. on the 7th of December. Finally, the Commission asked Mr. Roonacres for his expert opinion as to how he would expect a vehicle to appear which had been stationary in Workhouse Lane between 7 p.m. on the 6th of December and 8 a.m. on the 7th. Mr. Roonacres' expert report was received by the Commission on the 20th of April 2010. In relation to the absence of snow on the Range Rover, Mr. Roonacres concluded, quote, "It appears likely, although I cannot be certain, that no snowfall occurred after approximately 1700 hours on Wednesday the 6th of December 1995. It is clear from the witness evidence that the Range Rover must have arrived at Workhouse Lane after that time. Therefore, the lack of lying snow on the vehicle at the time it was discovered does not assist in determining the arrival time of the Range Rover." In relation to the absence of frost on the Range Rover, Mr. Roonacres concluded, quote, "Despite the shelter effects of the hedgerows and trees, as a result of the sub-zero air temperatures and relatively high humidities overnight and during the early morning hours, I would expect any vehicle that had been stationary in Workhouse Lane for a prolonged period of time prior to 8 AM on Thursday the 7th of December to have exhibited a hoar frost on its external surfaces. I cannot determine the precise length of time that would have been required for a hoar frost to form on the external surfaces of the Range Rover after it had arrived in Workhouse Lane and its ignition switched off. However, in my opinion, I consider it likely that this would not have required more than a few hours or so. Assuming the Range Rover was left undisturbed, I am currently unable to explain this apparent anomaly when compared to the prosecution case that the Range Rover arrived at the incident scene at approximately 1900 hours on Wednesday the 6th of December. Mr. Runeacre's report was disclosed to the applicants on the 6th of May 2010. Having considered the report, Mr. Steele has stated that he believes Mr. Runeacre's findings to be seriously flawed. He does not wish the Commission to rely on any of Mr. Runeacre's conclusions. Mr. Steele questions whether Mr. Runeacre is suitably qualified to offer an expert opinion, since he possesses no qualification in the science of meteorology. Mr. Steele also points out that, in any event, meteorology is an inexact science. Mr. Steele disagrees with Mr. Runeacre on the following points. Mr. Steele disagrees with the conclusion that it is, quote, likely that no snowfall occurred after approximately 1700 hours on Wednesday the 6th of December. He points out that 2 witnesses described it snowing in the vicinity of the scene of the crime after 1700 hours on the day in question. Kevin Tarbuck stated it was snowing at 1950, statement S51 dated the 14th of December, and Ian Williams stated that it started snowing lightly just before 2030 hours, statement S73 dated the 19th of December 1995. Mr. Steele states that a heavy vehicle like the Range Rover would have left tyre tracks, and the absence of these can only be explained by their being covered with snow after the vehicle arrived. The absence of snow on the vehicle can also be explained by the warmth of its surfaces when it arrived at the scene, and or a coating of glycol antifreeze which Mr. Steele suggests had recently been applied to the vehicle. The Commission notes that if Mr. Steele is correct in this observation, then this further undermines the defence proposition that the absence of frost on the Range Rover indicated that it had not been in Workhouse Lane overnight. Mr. Steele disagrees with the conclusion that it, quote, would not have required more than a few hours or so for a hoar frost to form on the external surfaces of the Range Rover after it had arrived in Workhouse Lane and its ignition switched off. Mr. Steele states that the absence of frost can be accounted for by the shelter which was provided by the surrounding foliage and or a coating of glycol antifreeze. Mr. Womes has also considered Mr. Runeacre's report and has provided his own observations. Like Mr. Steele, Mr. Womes disagrees with Mr. Runeacre on the subject of snow, pointing out that there must have been snowfall after the arrival of the Range Rover because Mr. Jiggins stated at trial that on the morning of the 7th of December, quote, there was a lot of snow and ice over the puddles, and none of the ice had been broken. The Commission notes conversely that the fact that the ice not having been broken suggests that the Range Rover may well have been in a lane for some time. Okay, so let's highlight this specific part of the document for one moment, and it's worth noting here that this is really kind of summing up Michael Steele's own thoughts on the lack of snow and frost found on the Range Rover. And it's in the document that it states the following. The absence of snow on the vehicle can also be explained by the warmth of its surfaces when it arrived at the scene and or a coating of glycol antifreeze which Mr. Steele suggests had recently been applied to the vehicle. Now, before I give my own opinion regarding how likely I believe this to be, the fact that someone has coated the vehicle in ethylene glycol or, antifreeze, let's talk about my first thoughts when reading that in the document. Now, when I came across that in the document, I thought to myself, Christ, that sounds a little bit far-fetched. Why would someone bother to do that? Why would someone bother to muddy the waters that much? Why would someone bother to coat it in antifreeze so that the vehicle isn't found, with frost on the next morning? Is it really that important? That's the first thing that went through my head. It sounds a little bit far-fetched, a little bit out there. So then I did a little bit of research. into ethylene glycol itself, antifreeze, thinking about the time period, 1995, DNA, I guess, really being in its infancy, particularly compared to now with the the advancements in DNA technology and all that sort of stuff. And then I thought to myself, hang on a minute, would someone have used that in order to clean the crime scene, clean the Range Rover? Would they have used something like ethylene glycol, which is obviously a toxic liquid? Would you use such a material in order to try and wipe the Range Rover down after the murders? And is that why the Range Rover does appear a little bit strange in places, almost as if it's been cleaned? Now, I've done videos on this before with someone, a very close friend of the channel who's done a lot of work with me on this case. And he came up with some good ideas regarding flash photography being used in some of the crime scene photographs, hence the reason that the front of the vehicle looks different compared to the rear because a flash has been used. But the Range Rover, as I say, in places does look incredibly clean. I spoke to the same individual regarding this particular point, and he came up with a different suggestion, which was quite interesting. He said it may well just be the windscreen washers. You can see in the photographs there that the rear windscreen wash and wipers being used could still be referring there to the fact that this liquid has got onto the vehicle, and that is somehow, along with the warmth of the vehicle as it had been driven all day, that's the reason that the frost didn't form. Is that what Steele is trying to say there? But when I read it again, it doesn't sound like it to me. It just doesn't. And just listen again. The absence of snow on the vehicle can also be explained by the warmth of its surfaces when it's arrived at the scene, and or a coating of glycol antifreeze, which Mr. Steele suggests had recently been applied to the vehicle. Now, when I read that word there, applied to the vehicle, to me that's telling me it's an intentional act. Now, I'm trying not to read too much into this, but surely if he means that this is as a result of the windscreen washers, or maybe a car that they're following behind and some liquid has now got onto their Range Rover, surely you would just say something along the lines of a barrier of antifreeze formed on the vehicle, hence the reason that no frost was found. Surely you would say that. You wouldn't actually use the words a coating of antifreeze was recently applied to the vehicle. Surely what Michael Steele is actually saying there is that it was an intentional act, that someone has applied this to the vehicle on purpose. Now, I've done a little bit of research on ethylene glycol over the last couple of days, and I'm finding it quite hard to really get any exact answers in terms of ethylene glycol's effect on DNA evidence, or evidence of crime scenes. It doesn't really seem to be a common theme or a common link between those two. But if we go back to 1995, as I say, with DNA being in its infancy, and I guess really the scene itself, it's snowing, or it had been snowing, it's freezing conditions, is it really beyond the realms of possibility that someone may take an object like that with them in order to possibly thaw a certain area or clean a certain area after a crime had been committed? To me, I can actually see that being quite likely, particularly because of the snow and the ice and the cold conditions of the evening of December the 6th. I think what I find a little bit surprising about this part of the document here is Michael Steele's attitude towards this expert and his opinion. Not so much that he disagrees with the expert, but the fact that this guy's actually come forward, Mr. Rooney, because he's come forward and he said, I do find it a little bit strange that there was no frost on the vehicle. I would have expected a hoar-type frost to have been present on the Range Rover, as it had been there for, if it had been there, I should say, for more than a few hours. Yet Michael Steele's almost rebuffing this, and this is really what the defence have been saying all along. The Range Rover had no frost, it had no snow, it had no ice on it. It was almost as if it had just arrived down the lane that morning. How can we explain this? And there's an expert who's actually been, employed or taken on by, this appeal process, and he's gone into all of the information. He's come back and almost, I guess, mirrored what the defence are saying. But Michael Steele is actually rebuffing this guy's evidence here. Now, many people out there who are supporters of Michael Steele and Jack Wombs and their innocence, I'm sure that they're listening to this and thinking to themselves, well, why would someone who's guilty not take every possible available opportunity and every piece of available, bit of information to use to bolster their claim of innocence? Why wouldn't they use that? And I guess really that's kind of what I'm thinking when I'm reading this. You've got this expert here who's come forward and said, I find it very bizarre that the Range Rover was found the way it was if it had been parked there since 7 o'clock the night before. I don't think that that's quite correct. Yet Michael still, as I say, is refusing this. He's almost saying, this guy has no qualifications, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. I mean, really, the only logical way that I can explain this in a different way, I suppose, is if Michael Steele has read this report and he's thinking to himself, actually, this is never going to get through the court at all. Of course it isn't, because it did snow, the night of, around that time period that this guy is saying that it didn't. There are actual explanations as to why the vehicle would have been found frost-free on the morning of the 7th, and this isn't just going to, wash, basically. And maybe that's what he's saying here, but as I say, I do find it quite strange that he's not taking every possible opportunity here, from especially from people who the CCRC and whoever claim to be experts. I'm surprised that he's not taking every available opportunity to help bolster his innocence here. I also find it quite interesting that Michael Steele here is almost going above and beyond the call of duty in terms of discrediting this theory. It's not just as though he's saying, well, hang on a minute, the vehicle was used all through the day, the vehicle was warm, the bodies after they died would still have had a certain amount of heat expelled from them, the vehicle was close to vegetation, exchanging radiation, etc., etc. Most people have seen the video that I've done on the frost and the snow theory, which was kindly thought out and provided to me by Mr. Roy, at least the script and the information that was contained within that video. But he's not just stopping there. For some reason, he's now going on to ethylene glycol, and the Range Rover could have been covered in that. It's really, I do find it a little bit strange, actually. All of this part of the document, I really do. I can't really make much sense of why he's saying this. You have an expert who's trying to, or I guess not trying to, but he's almost bolstering his own version of events, or his potential innocence, and he's not taking it. He's not taking that opportunity. But not only that, he's also adding other things into it to explain why the vehicle would have been found frost-free. The addition of, someone applying antifreeze to the vehicle. Now, with the videos that I create, I try and offer as many different perspectives as possible, at least perspectives that make sense to me personally. So it'd be wrong of me to not look at this from a different angle for one moment. Now, let's go back and look at the version of events put forward by Darren Nichols, as when I read this part of the document, it's also something which sprung up in my own mind. Now, he claims that he's waiting down the lane to collect Steele and Womes, and it's in his statement under oath that he states the following. I didn't see anyone, and after a short period of time, the back door opened and Jack got in. I didn't notice the interior light come on. I said, where's Mick? He said, he won't be a minute, he's dropped something. Jack was sitting between the back seats talking to me. Then Mick opened the passenger door of the car and the interior light came on. Now, this is a big talking point in this case regarding, well, what was Steele doing? What was he collecting? Was he picking up the pieces of the gun? How could he have done that? It was dark. They didn't have a torch with them from the as best we can tell. So what exactly was he doing? Why was he late back to the getaway car? And then I had the thought, well, maybe that's why he was late back to the getaway car. Maybe that's why Womes gets in first and Steele's lagging behind, because he's using this glycol on the vehicle. Is that what he's doing? Is he throwing it over the vehicle? Is he wiping bits off? He's been in the vehicle, he's been out of the vehicle, he's probably touched the handles. Is that what he's doing down there? I mean, I guess what counts against that is that it's not mentioned anywhere in Darren Nichols' statement that Steele gets into the car with a bottle of bloody antifreeze or whatever. So I don't know. It's just something that popped into my head. When you read these documents, when you look at the case, obviously, you have your own ideas. You run certain scenarios through your mind. And that's just something that came up to me because I've never really bought into this fact that he's scrambling around for bits of a gun or anything like that. It doesn't really seem to make much sense. But could he have been there trying to clean the crime scene or clean off the Range Rover in certain parts? I don't know. It's just an idea, as I say. Certainly, one aspect I think that we can all agree on is that there was no DNA evidence found at the scene, and there has to be a reason for that. Now, it's either that the killer or killers got incredibly lucky, it either melted away in the snow potentially, or they're well versed in the act of killing, they've done this before, or they obviously planned this crime methodically, and that, with the combination of a bit of luck, managed to leave no trace behind, or were steps taken to clean the scene after the crime was committed.